You're traveling through the unknown, a journey beyond the corners of reality, where the shadows whisper and the chill runs deep. Welcome to the dimension where your deepest fears are given form. This is the Midnight Mystery.
Twice I saw the face in the window, pressed up against the surface, its icy breath fogging the cold glass. At first it appeared strange to me, the skin beneath its eyes drooping in ripples of flesh, exposing the red sensitive strata underneath. It was the winter of '83, and I had booked the cabin for 3 nights, only 3. A break was needed, somewhere to relax, somewhere to recover. I'd had a heart attack 2 months earlier, a painful, excruciating experience which I would not wish on my worst enemy. Lying there sprawled across my kitchen floor, the sharp agony had siphoned through my veins, chest, arm, jaw. I lost consciousness only to find myself in a hospital bed days later. It was my daughter Jen who discovered me. Thank God for her. The cabin was to be a retreat, a place far removed from the stresses of my life. The fallout from a failed marriage, the pressures of a flagging career, and the ordeal of staring death in the face. Comfort had become a stranger. Fear, however, was now both my enemy and constant companion. Each beat of my heart was felt, the slightest change of rhythm or palpitation a nursery for terror. The knowledge that, at any time, the agony of death could be brought upon me by the very thing which gave life seemed perverted, an abomination of purpose. I now wandered through life like glass, afraid that the slightest exertion might shatter me. The doctors had done their part through surgery and medication. Now it was my turn to help my body heal as best it could. Only time would tell how successful such efforts had been. I was advised to relax, to undertake some limited physical therapy, and to avoid any anxiety or sudden shocks. But how does one avoid a shock or a nasty surprise? By its very definition, a shock is an unknown, unforeseen, unexpected event which lurks in the darkness of obscurity, out there, mingled with the fog of yet to come. Around a corner, in the next room, a wrong turn taken, or an unwelcome phone call bearing bad news. I found the entire concept of avoiding the unanticipated to be a laughable one. And still, there I was, preparing for the quiet solitude of the countryside, following the advice of the experts and those men and women in sterile white coats. I had almost ignored their recommendations, remaining slumped at home, festering, counting the hours and beats of my heart as finite measures of my life. When still, the mind can unleash a terrible onslaught of memories. I thought of Susie, of the years spent together and now wasted. We had been happy once, but I had played my part in where we ended. She came to visit me in the hospital. Perhaps she too wished for reconciliation, but feeling the gulf between us, as she sat at my bedside, was worse than any physical heartache. We smiled and spoke the empty words of day-to-day which litter each and every hospital ward. As she left, she touched my hand for the briefest of moments, and yet I could tell that she no longer sheltered the spark she once had for me. She tried to be kind, but some things done and said can never be taken back. A fire of resentment which can never be extinguished. They say time heals all wounds, but some cuts are deeper than others. In those bleak days of loneliness, I had only the thought of my daughter to keep me from slipping into a dark depression, and yet she stayed with her mother most of the time. Perhaps I had been cold towards her too. I knew my failings as a husband, but I had never conceived that I had been anything but a loving father, and so I lived for those brief 2 days a week when I could see her. The in-between times were filled with fear of death and thoughts of worthlessness. Friends, family, doctors, they all urged me to go on a holiday, but I was afraid, scared of my heart giving up, frightened by the possibilities brought forth by an anxious mind preoccupied with the fragile body which housed it. If it hadn't been for Jai, I would never have gone. He visited me several times a week and encouraged me to be as upbeat as possible with his usual quips and jokes. He kept me going, in fact, and finally persuaded me that a few days away in the countryside would do me good. Still, I was terrified of being left alone, isolated. away from things and people. What if I had another attack? Perhaps the next one would be fatal, and even if I could be saved, I would be too far for help to reach me in time. I needed somewhere that I could relax away from the world, and yet not so far from the wonders of modern medicine. That was why we chose Blackwood Cabin. Jai had visited there as a child. It sat on the outskirts of a large forest, hemmed in on a patch of open ground by a beautiful flowing river on the other side. Despite its seeming detachment from the world, it was in fact only 6 miles from the nearest hospital, which stood near a small town on the boundary of that thick, darkened web of trees. This, and the insistence of Jai that he stay as well, left me contented enough in the knowledge that help would always be at hand. I could feel myself begin to relax as we left the city, and during the drive we both talked and laughed, reminiscing about our days together at university. For the first time in months, I felt positive about the world, watching the motorway recede into the distance, relinquishing its concrete grip to the wild, untamed, and imposing grandeur of the great outdoors. Only once did I bring up the mention of Susie and our separation, but Jai quickly turned the conversation around to something more positive and fun, as he often did. I held out hope that the divorce would never be finalized, that she would come back to me, but hope too can be an exhausting predicament. So I attempted to filter Susie from my mind as best I could. The single-track road weaved its way through Blackwood Forest. We wriggled over 6 miles of twists and turns and serpentine slitherings before we finally reached the clearing. A large, waterlogged patch of wild grass carpeted the area, so much so that we had to park the car a few of 100 feet from our destination for fear of getting stuck. In the center of the soaked, near marshland ground, stood the rickety and aging shelter, which we intended to call home for the following 3 days. The cabin was itself small, with one main room complete with cozy log burner and stove, and 2 cramped bedrooms at the back. It had been there for an age, that much was certain, and the darkened timber beams which carried the heavy burden of time above sagged and dipped as they lurched across the ceiling. The smell of moss and bark swathed the air, and the sound of the flowing river on the other side of the cabin bubbled and brewed, peaceful, serene, yet mysterious. The first day was uneventful, exactly what I needed, relaxing with a book in front of 3 large logs smoldering in the fire, and spending a little while sitting on the steps to the cabin, watching the river swell and swarm with the winter currents. It was then that I understood the naming of the place. Peering out across the bobbled grass to the tree line, the forest seemed picturesque yet impenetrable from distance, and the clearing where the cabin sat provided only a temporary pause to its encroachment, before it once again continued to blanket the land on the other side of the river. The woodland was dark and black, yes, but full of life, of vibrancy, of things. Deer, foxes, beetles, rabbits. But I would never have guessed at the horrors which lurked between its tightly woven evergreen branches. Many tourist traps survive on tales of ghosts and ghouls hidden somewhere nearby, stories exaggerated by pub landlords or hotel managers, speaking of rooms where something ominous walks at the midnight hour. Visitors flock to such places hoping to spend the night in a haunted room, to glimpse something in the darkness which whispers the thought that life is more bizarre, more interesting than we could possibly imagine. Even that lonely and forgotten cabin seemed to have something of a myth attached to it. In a bookshelf, tucked away in the corner of one of the bedrooms, Jai found a warped old hardback. The papers were yellowed, and while it contained the publication date of 1967, I was certain that it had only ever seen one pressing, left in the cabin to titillate those staying there. The book was called The Beast of Blackwood Forest. Rifling through it, I found that the author had dedicated much of her life to the documentation of a local legend. I had myself heard the stories when I was younger, as I had once dated a girl who lived in a nearby town. All the kids talked about the Beast of Blackwood, a creature which everyone's uncle had seen while out hunting in the forest, dark, hulking, monstrous. Of course, I always laughed at such things, and no concrete evidence for it had ever been found, but each winter there were rumors, whispers about something shambling through the woods at night. As the day gave way to twilight, I read through some of those pages while Jai stocked the stove and prepared supper. Although I discarded the legend as nonsense, I found the book quite compelling, and the eyewitness testimonies contained therein affected me enough to cause me to see something which wasn't there. Shadows moving outside under the cloak of dusk. I began to feel my heart once more and decided that it was best to leave the terrors of the horror genre, fact and fiction, behind. My mind was still fraught with the strain of Susie leaving me and the fear of the slightest palpitation signaling another heart attack, so accounts of a terrifying creature preying on those in my immediate vicinity, no matter how preposterous, were not suitable for a fragile disposition. The clean country air, on the other hand, was doing me the world of good. After dinner, Jai surprised me with a bottle of my favorite whiskey, 16-year Lagavulin. I knew that the doctors would frown upon it, but the idea of swishing that warming liquid gold around my mouth and taking a deep gulp reminded me of something essential. It reminded me of being normal again, of being strong, of sitting in my family home with my wife and daughter, enjoying the finer side of life. A few drams would not be unwelcome. We talked and laughed about the past while playing cards and enjoying, again, reliving old adventures we had traveling together during our university summers with the old gang. I would have happily stayed there wrapped in the comfort of those memories for an eternity, and in many ways I wish I could have sunk further into that moment of relief from my recent worries, but that was not to be. Around 11 o'clock, the log burner was running low, and we had all but run out of wood. Jai drunkenly picked up a torch and decided that he would go and quickly gather some more so that we could keep the good times flowing. I didn't protest. I was happy. I was content to allow that night to continue. He was a good friend and insisted that I not raise a finger out there in the cold darkness. He always was braver than me, and I'd be lying if I said that the outlandish thought of something lurking in the woods hadn't left its mark. I watched from the window for a moment as the beam from his torch bounced along the uneven, now frozen, grass. The light dropped to the ground for a second, and I heard the drunken, merry laughter of my friend echoing out as he picked himself back up before continuing towards the tree line. Smiling, I returned to my book of choice, flicking through a few pages of an Ellery Queen detective novel, less dangerous than the previous read. After about 15 minutes, I realized how truly silent the cabin was. No noise, no wind, no sounds of life or the living, and for the first time I sensed something sinister resting in the stillness. Suddenly, Jai burst into the cabin and collapsed on the floor, panting. He turned to the door and kicked it shut with his heels frantically, his eyes wide, panicked, disbelieving. Scrambling back to his feet, he turned a small table on its end and wedged it against the skin of the aging wood under the handle. "Help me, for Christ's sake," he whispered anxiously. I stood up quickly and rushed to me friend's aid, helping him pack furniture, anything with weight, against the door. It was the first time since the heart attack that I had physically exerted myself, and it would not be the last. I felt the blood pump through my chest and momentarily quivered at the sensation. I tried to find out what had happened, but Jai was exhausted and distraught. A shiny streak of sweat ran down his cheek as he wheezed and gasped for air. He flicked the light switch, smothering us in a darkness which was only broken by a crescent moon hanging in the sky outside, its slivered light vaguely illuminating the inside of the cabin. Prowling the window which gazed out towards the forest, his stare never broke for a moment from the frozen world outside. We stood there, my repeated questions going unanswered, and slowly my fragility returned. I rubbed my chest for a moment as my friend's anxiety seemed to spread to me. My heart raced, and my mind swung like a pendulum between the fear of an agonizing heart attack and the terror etched on Jai's face. Just what had scared him so badly? I breathed deeply to calm myself, but Jai took no notice. He was too fixated on the darkness outside. It was only when I poured him a large whiskey that he finally broke his silence. I've never been frightened of words, but my friends certainly shook me. There's something out there. I did not reply immediately, but when I did, I could only think to ask, something. What could he have meant by such an indefinite term? There were no bears in that part of the country, no large predators at all. But it did indeed seem that Jai had seen something big in the woods. He had been gathering wood for the stove around the tree line of the forest, and as he described standing there listening to a short flurry of rain tap the canopy above him, I could see the fear grip his insides, as it did mine. My heart began to pound harder as Jai stuttered over the words. I saw it moving between the trees, straight for me. I didn't look back, but I'm telling you, it wasn't human. I knew my friend was convinced by what he said, but while I dismissed the notion of an unknown creature stalking the woods outside, and perhaps in the attempt, hid the descriptions from the yellowed pages of that book which had etched into my mind, I very much did entertain the idea that there was someone out there, someone dangerous, mad, or perhaps both. My pulse continued to race, and I could feel my heart beating wildly at the thought of a shadowy figure prowling around outside, watching us, waiting. After finally composing himself, Jai asked if I was okay, his fear now turning to concern for his friend. But I myself was transfixed on one course of action: escape. I rushed over to the cabin's phone, but on picking up the receiver I was greeted by an icy silence. The line was dead, and what that still, lifeless receiver said about the unseen threat I was sure we now faced was enough to thrust dread into my very soul. I stood there for a moment, desperately trying to formulate a course of action. That serene, peaceful place in the daytime now felt imposing and absent of mercy. I just wanted to go home. Jai motioned for me, and then pointed with shaking hand at the darkness outside. It was then that he let out a suffocated whisper. It's there. Looking out into the moonlit night, I saw nothing at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkened landscape outside, I finally saw it. Deep down, I had hoped that Jai had simply drunk too much and spooked himself while out there, but now any dream of a simple and harmless explanation was extinguished. Someone was standing amongst the trees, just standing and looking, bathed in darkness. It was difficult to make out any detail. All I could see was an outline, the outline of a stooped and hunched figure, its arm wrapped around a tree as if steadying itself. I could not be sure, but it felt as though its stare was firmly transfixed on our cabin, our rickety shelter for the night, which had no doubt seen many winters there before, and perhaps even encountered whoever or whatever was looking at us from across the sodden stretch of icy marsh which surrounded us. Who is that? I stammered. Keep your voice down, Jai snapped in return. And so we whispered, and spoke of the hunched figure standing only a few hundred feet from us. It's not a man, Jai kept saying, but I continued in my attempts to dissuade him from that conclusion. I saw it through the trees. It moved. It moved in a weird way, limping, like it was off balance or deformed or something. But it moved fast. I've no idea how I made it back. Maybe it won't leave the trees. His eyes widened, and it was clear that a revelation had sprung forth from his mind. He turned suddenly, walking across the room to a table where I had left those yellowed pages which spoke of a strange creature living in the woods. Jai thumbed through it, shielding the light from his torch as best he could with his hand. As I watched him scan through the contents and flick to what he seemed so animated about, I almost laughed at the insinuation. It's a man, Jai. Just someone messing with us. But he was convinced otherwise. Look at this, he said, following the text with his finger as he read. Accounts have varied over the centuries, but a central element to the myth states that the beast of Blackwood only wanders from the forest late at night. It has been suggested that the creature uses the thick canopy as protection during daylight hours. Locals claim that it is entirely nocturnal. There's no such thing as the beast. I could feel my pulse thicken as my blood pressure increased at the idea, so much so that I had to sit for a moment to allow my heart to recover its normal beat. Are you okay? I'll be fine. Let's just wait until it gets light and we can leave. Are you crazy? You didn't see that thing up close. It's huge and quick. If it wants to get in here, it will. So, there's a weirdo in the woods. He can't wait us out all night anyway. He's probably just a hunter or someone camping in the forest. He'll be harmless. I listened to the words exit my mouth. Even I didn't believe them. There was something about the place, a silence, deathly, icy, a sickly sense of dread hanging in the air, hidden between the bark and the moss. Jai turned to look outside to the grassland which etched towards our car, sleeping in the night chill between us and the brooding forest. "We need to leave, or you can stay here and I'll get the police. Either way, I'm going." He turned to look at me sternly. "Which would you prefer?" I might not have been convinced that it had been an unknown creature that had stalked him through the woods, but by God, I didn't want to stay in that cabin alone. I threw my stuff in a bag, as Jai did the same, each of us grabbing a knife from the kitchen for protection. And there we stood, looking at the door, a pile of furniture wedged behind it. We dismantled our makeshift barricade as quietly as we could, and then, brandishing our kitchen knives nervously, slowly opened the door. It creaked softly, sucking in the night air which felt cold and bitter, and revealed a slow patter of light rain threatening something greater from the heavens. Jai poked his head out first, and then after a brief silence, waved me on. We descended the dozen or so steps which led down onto the grass, and as we peered around the corner, we could see our ticket home. The car was parked a few hundred feet from where we stood, nestled in the last piece of dirt track, which would give way to road, and then the safe embrace of home, if we made it. It would take a minute or so to reach, but with knowledge of the figure in the forest lurking around somewhere nearby, it seemed like an eternity away. I slung the strap of my bag over my shoulder, and Jai, mindful of my condition, headed towards the car first. "Keep looking around," he urged me with a whisper. The waterlogged grass squelched underfoot, and the rain began to grow more angered as we stepped tentatively towards the safety of the car. We tried to be as quiet as possible, but even in the moonlight we had to use our torches to see what was ahead of us, advertising our position to anyone or anything in the vicinity. I kept looking out towards the forest, the tree line, the thickening river behind me, but I could see nothing, nor could I hear anything but the raindrops, which now battered against the car and splattered on my hood. Then, Jai suddenly stopped. "What is it?" I whispered over the rain, my heart now beating wildly, throat dried by worry. The rain subsided slightly, replaced by the silence of a landscape petrified, frozen by a winter chill. Jai spoke without turning his head towards me, his breath visible in the beam of my torch. "I thought I saw something moving in the tree line." A crack of wood, the sound of the unseen walking over the forest floor. "Come on," Jai whispered with urgency, and we broke into a brisk jog. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as my pulse thumped desperately. As we continued on, all I could think of was my heart and the deep, stuttered and freezing breaths I took in trying to calm myself. As we drew closer to the car, the faintest wisp of moonlight hung in the air, as the crescent above us swung behind a pack of clouds, and the world took on a strange, icy blue. Stumbling over the grass, we finally reached the gray outline of our ride home. "Open the door, let's get out of here," I pleaded as Jai fumbled for his keys, dropping them to the ground. "Bastard," he growled. Instinctively, I pointed my torch downward, illuminating the long, wild grass, now whitened by a thick coating of frost beneath our feet. I waited for an instant, and as I peered down at the ground, I recognized that something was very wrong. Jai was not moving. He hadn't even looked down to see where he had dropped the keys. He was staring at something, and the look of sheer panic in his eyes told me that we were not alone. I raised my hand, and with it a beam of light glinted off of the car. Two large eyes stared back from the other side of the vehicle, a hunched, hulking thing, glaring up at us, crouched behind the car bonnet. It shivered, and then again, and as it rose up I saw it for a moment. Wet-drenched hair, mouth gaping, its face a pallid and quivering gray. It groaned loud with a strange, unearthly and high-pitched undertone, which only added to the creature's horrid appearance. "Run!" Jai yelled. I did not need to be told twice. I dropped my bag and ran as fast as I could. I panted, sweat, stumbled, thrust myself forward with every ounce of energy I had left in me, and as I did so, the first pains came. The freezing cold stung my eyes. I fell twice, helped to my feet by my friend. My heart staggered. It heaved and battered in my chest. I could feel the slight twinge of pain run up my neck, nestle in my jaw. My chest tightened. I cried in terror. This was a heart attack. I yelled out, "Help!" But all I could hear was Jai running behind me, screaming for me to move faster. "Keep going, and don't look back." As the cabin came into touching distance, I heard the heartbreaking absence of my friend's footsteps. I knew Jai. All those years as close as we were, he was always the brave one, something I had at times been jealous of, the one stubborn enough to stand up to anything. I understood implicitly that he was buying me time, a selfless gesture which helped me make it to the steps, scrambling up them only to turn and see him staring the creature down, face to face, the beast shrouded in shards of night. As its hulking mass lunged towards him, a searing pain ran up my neck from my chest. I collapsed to the ground, but he needed me, and whatever life was left in my failing body, I was compelled to use to help him. Staggering to my feet, the night air stinging my lungs, I lurched forward, clutching my chest, ready to strike the beast with everything I had left. Before I could assist, Jai appeared from the darkness, grabbed my arm and threw me into the cabin. He frantically barricaded the door once more. We slumped to the floor, breathless, deciding to keep the lights out, and listened, shuffling in the darkness, but nothing more. The pain in my chest had subsided slightly. It was clear that the heart attack had begun, but when it would end, me seemed uncertain. What was that thing?" I asked between gasps. "I don't know, but it wasn't human," said Jai solemnly, before showing me the knife he had used during the fight, now covered in a putrid black liquid. "I don't think even this hurt it much. This is crazy. What do we do now?" "I don't know. I just don't know." And so, we waited, and waited. But the pain in my chest grew steadily, my breath more erratic. I took my pills, but I knew that the old enemy had returned, and that I needed more than something to calm my nerves. If I didn't receive medical attention, there was every chance I would die. Jai stared at me as I sat on the old couch against the window, worried that each breath would be my last. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said gently. "Yeah, just chopper me in." We both laughed for a moment. Jai stood up and looked outside. He seemed reluctant at first, and no wonder considering what lurked outside, but his concern for me appeared to slowly drown out his fear. "I can't see anything out there anymore. The moon is behind those clouds, and we might not get another chance. I think I can make it to the car quicker on my own." "But that thing out there," I said, deep down ashamed that my fear of death galvanized a hope that my friend would indeed find the courage to try again. He leaned over me and smiled kindly, patting me on the shoulder. "I can do this. It's pitch black out there. You'd need to use a torch, and then it would see you," I said, wincing once more at the growing pain in my chest. "I'll flash it on and off. That way it won't know where I am. Maybe it'll get confused. I don't know." He clenched the torch tightly, while looking at the kitchen knife in his other hand. "Hopefully that'll give me enough time to see what's in front of me and head for the car. The keys should still be where I dropped them." "Jai, please wait until morning," I asked. But as my friend looked at me clutching my chest, I knew he had already made up his mind, and part of me was glad for the hope his bravery provided. "Barricade the door as soon as I'm out." "Okay," I said, trying to hold back tears both of pain and worry for my friend's life. He gave me a hug, and then he was gone. I closed the door and bolstered it once more with anything I could find, before pulling myself back up onto the couch and looking outside. At first I could see nothing but the black stillness of the forest, then a blast of light, then another, and another as Jai's torch sporadically burst into life. Each flash illuminated the landscape around him like a ghostly photograph documenting his progress towards the car. I could see what he was doing, and I smiled to myself for a moment, once more impressed by his ingenuity. He wasn't moving in a straight line, but zigzagging so that his path could not be anticipated. Another flash, and another. Each time, no sign of the creature and one more precious movement closer to the car. Grass, tree, an anonymous wilderness of darkness. Another flash, another patch of grass. He was so close. Then the intermittent light became erratic, moving one way, then another. Backwards, left, right. Was he lost? Was he unsure which direction the car was in? A more horrific thought then entered my mind. Was he being chased? A flash of light, nothing, then another, nothing again. Finally, the light beamed. He'd made it to the car. The light was quickly extinguished, followed by the sound of a door opening. One last flash of the torch. The isolated outline of a hunched figure standing behind my friend. A blood-curdling scream, then nothing. Jai was gone, the beast had got him, and I was alone. Grief now mingled with fear, feeding the pains in my chest and arm. My friend was most probably dead, and I was certain that I would soon follow him. I fell to my knees, sure that this was it. The end. Agony ran up my chest once more. There I knelt in the darkness, alone, resigned to my death. But as my heart slowed, my thoughts became clear. They turned to my daughter. Whether a good dad or not, I would be damned if I was going to leave her fatherless. And what of Susie? I still loved her, and perhaps in those sweet memories of better times between us, I could fix things, bring us back together as a family. She could learn to love me again. I would set things right. My heart still beat, and as long as it did, there was time left yet for hope, for escape, for life. But time to do what? The phone was dead, and all I could wait for was daylight. Yet that was at least 3 hours away, and I severely doubted that I would last that long. Never mind that I was unsure that the old cabin door could survive an attack from whatever that hulking creature was which lurked outside. I peered out through the window, the rain lashing down once more, obscuring an already ill-defined exterior world. And still, I was certain I could see something limping around in the darkness. As glints of moonlight pierced through the charcoal clouds above, I was sure that the attacker was out there somewhere, pacing, circling, waiting. But what was it? Was it a man, or a thing yet to be discovered by science? I did not know where to turn, but all I could think of was getting home to my family. The hopeful, warm embrace of Susie and my daughter was enough to fuel my search for a way out. My only refuge was the book, that volume which I had mocked so readily before. I had to now consider the possibility that my dear friend and I had both come into contact with the beast of Blackwood. At the start of the day, that idea would have seemed ridiculous, but fear opens the mind quickly to any avenue of escape. I sat at the table and used the light from my torch to illuminate the pages, still shielding it from the outside. What I read intrigued me. The creature had been described since the 1700s, and there was even the suggestion that it had been seen before that, as there were references to the Grey Man of Blackwood Forest in fragmented accounts from centuries earlier. There didn't seem to be much in the way of 20th century sightings. In fact, the last person to come forward officially had been in 1952, claiming to have encountered a stooped, gray-faced figure with a contorted arched back, disappearing between the trees on the other side of the forest. The original myths did not say much about its origins, but it certainly spoke of its motivations. The creature was drawn or attracted by greed. Children would be told to share and be kind, otherwise the beast of Blackwood would appear from the forest and snatch them away at night. I could not look in the mirror and say that I was never guilty of greed, of selfishness, or of a number of other petty human frailties, but to be punished in this way seemed cruel. A dying prisoner trapped in the cabin of Blackwood Forest. Returning to the book, the only supposed protection against the creature was light, or being a person without selfish frailty. In centuries gone by, villagers in the local area would line the paths through the forest with burning torches when the beast had been sighted. to ward it away from unwary travelers. Thud, thud, thud. Each thump sent waves of terror through my body. It was not my heart, but someone at the door. Thud, thud, thud. I hoped beyond hope that my friend had once again managed to evade the creature's grasp. Brandishing a kitchen knife, I hobbled to the door and plucked up the courage to shout, "Jai, is that you?" I prayed that it was, but the answer I was given was not the voice of one of my oldest friends, nor was it even that of a man, but the shrill cry of something utterly inhuman, a sound which spoke of time and age and of moss and dank forest. A childlike shriek of unspeakable purpose. The door shook violently as I piled more chairs, pots, anything I could find, behind the wooden barrier. The pounding was loud and angered, and the cries continued. I clutched my ears in despair. Then I remembered. The light. The torches of old warding the beast away. I flicked the switch, and the porch light came on outside. Another cry echoed out across the empty landscape, and at that, the thudding stopped. I quickly turned all the lights on in the house, now realizing the creature's weakness. I wasn't sure if I would last, but if I could just make it till dawn, maybe the sun would save me. Then I heard it, the sound of something moving, shuffling, climbing. I stood paralyzed at the realization it came from my bedroom. The beast had gotten in, attracted no doubt by any greed and selfishness I had harbored throughout my life. Slowly, the door from the bedroom creaked open. My heart pounded, and again my thoughts turned to my family, to my daughter's laugh, and the comforting caress of my wife. They fueled me, drove me to a strength I did not know I had. I launched in terror across the room, battering against the door. Even with all of my momentum, the creature's hand managed to slip through the gap, its bobbled gray skin and black matted hair soaked by the rain. I swung with the knife only to miss its arm. The beast seemed to hesitate for a moment, and as it did, I shoved my hand through the gap in the door and flicked on the light in the room. A howl of pain, and then nothing. I gasped for air and rested against the door for a time, before I finally plucked up the courage to look inside. A window lay wide open, but the room was empty. I closed the window and staggered back into the main room. My heart raced, and while I fought to stay on my feet, a sweeping pain arched up through my back and needled into my chest, knocking the wind out of me. I felt like I was going to pass out and stumbled forward, landing on the couch. I breathed slow and deep. Not yet. Please, God, not yet. The cabin remained eerily quiet, and in that silence sat the memories of better times, of my daughter playing as a child, of traveling with Jai in our 20s, of Susie's smile. I don't know how long I lay there, but I knew that soon my body would give up. I looked out through the large bay window behind the couch and hoped to see the first welcome rays of sunlight, but I saw nothing but darkness. If I was to survive, I had to make it to that car, outrun the beast, and drive through the forest to a hospital, or at least a main road. If ever I was to see my family again, to put everything right, the car was my only hope. It was all or nothing. Then suddenly the creature's stilted head rose up from beneath the windowsill, the inhuman face pressed against the cold glass. Its gray skin sagged and weeped away from its eyes, the moist red flesh underneath visible in the cabin's light. The shock had finished me. My heart stopped for a brief moment and then thudded, struggling to maintain my life. My body went limp, my head resting only inches from the window. Looking up helplessly, I watched as the beast stared into my eyes through the pane of glass. My heart sprang into another deluge of beats, battering away at the inside of my chest. A sharp pain ran up my neck. The creature's green-tinged stare stabbed through me, and as its breath fogged the glass, I grabbed the only thing at hand, the old yellowed book, and thrust it at that putrid face. Book followed by fist shattered the glass. Countless pieces and shards showered down upon both beast and myself. A scream, a hideous shriek of derision cut through the icy blackened night as I struck those horrid, accursed features, and again, and again. Its thorned hands waved and flailed, grabbing hold of me, and for a second I thought it was going to tear me from the inside of the cabin. Then, the winter frost came to my defense. The beast slipped from its footing on a pipe which clung to the outside of the rickety old shack, and as I clawed at its face with utter disgust, the creature fell the 6 or 7 feet to the ground below. The sound of something hurt lying beneath the shattered window broke my daze as I stared at the contents of my hands. Where there once had been eyes, the face now stared eyeless at me. Where there once had been a mouth, the creature gaped wide, lifeless, jawless, and utterly without agency. For in my fading grip lay the torn and crumpled remains of a mask. On the ground below, a man writhed in pain, wrapped in the vestiges of a hulking, false, monstrous suit, the fall having knocked the wind from him. Something then moved in the darkness nearby, a patter of feet, light and agile. Susie, my soon-to-be ex-wife, the one I had adored and agonized over. She screamed, attending to her lover on the ground, my closest and dearest friend, Jai, the beast of Blackwood Forest. Susie looked up at me with hatred and contempt in her eyes. But I couldn't muster anger, nor jealousy. All I could think of was that I must have been a monster to have deserved such malice from those I loved, the 2 people I trusted most in the world. Jai slowly rose to his feet, and yet he could not acknowledge me. He could not look up to the friend he had betrayed. Then it came. Finally, my heart began to give in, not at fright or fear, but at sadness, loss, the anguish of a broken heart. I stood up, clutching my chest, and as I staggered backwards, I saw the smiling face of Susie, and then the words of my once trusted friend. Thank God. They embraced beneath the window as I fell to the cold and solid wooden cabin floor. And yet I did not lose consciousness. The pain was agonizing, but nothing compared to the sharp incisions made by each word spoken from below the window. "What are we going to do about the window?" Susie asked. "I'll just say that he smashed it during the heart attack. But maybe they'll guess?" "No, baby, they won't guess anything. He'll be dead, and we can start a new life together when the insurance pays out. Now, you need to go back to the woods and go home. I'll clean up here, and then phone an ambulance once I'm sure he's gone." I almost chuckled to myself as I writhed around helpless on the floor. I had hoped that Susie had refused a divorce because of love, because deep down, she still wanted me. But instead, it was only to hang on to how much money my death would make her. For a while, I heard Jai slip and swear as he attempted to climb up to the broken window once more. But each time, he failed to pull himself inside. He then changed tactic and tried to push at the door. But again, I had barricaded it effectively, and obviously he didn't want to force it and leave further evidence of foul play. It was then that he started shouting in anger, even cursing my name of all things. It was only a matter of time before he got in, cleaned the place up, and told the police how sorry he was that his dear old friend's heart just gave up. My last thoughts were of my daughter, of never having the chance to fix my mistakes as a father. I finally passed out, and yet my assumed death was not to be. I woke to find myself in the white glow of a hospital room, my hand held tightly by my daughter, who slept in a chair next to my bed. The doctor who attended to me said that I had suffered another heart attack, but one which was not as severe as the last, and that, while I was to take it easy, with some therapy, I would recover. The police were keen to speak with me. I gave them my account of what had occurred, and they in turn told me of all they knew. My unconscious body had been discovered next to a main road just outside of Blackwood Forest, on the outskirts of the nearest town. The cabin was thoroughly searched and was found in the same condition as I had left it. The window smashed, and the front door locked and barricaded from the inside. There was no trace of Jai or my wife. They simply could not be found. The only evidence that they had ever been there were their footprints in the mud around the cabin, accompanied by a third much larger set which led back, deep into Blackwood Forest. I wasn't the one that found Maddie. It was his wife, Elizabeth, back from a night shift at the hospital, eager to shed her scrubs and settle in for a long sleep. Instead, she walked into the bedroom to find Maddie sitting in a chair, his severed head in his lap. I would have preferred not to hear any further details about my brother's body, But when Elizabeth called me on the phone, hysterical, she couldn't help but overshare. Dark bruises covering his arms and legs. There was blood everywhere, soaking through his white t-shirt and striped pajama pants, pooling all around the wicker chair where he sat. The skin of his neck was frayed where it had been ripped apart, almost like a popped balloon. The muscle, too, was stretched and torn, and the vertebrae stuck from the top of his neck hole like a white sleeping worm. Though we hadn't spoken much in the last few years, I was the only family Maddie had left. I caught the next flight to Boston and met up with Elizabeth at her parents' house. She started screaming as soon as she saw me, or maybe she'd been screaming all day. Maybe I looked too much like my brother for her to handle. After a few hours, she calmed down enough to start saying a few words. I asked her if Maddie had been in any kind of trouble. He'd been reckless in his late teens and early 20s, selling drugs on campus. It was small-time stuff, but he'd made a few bad enemies. Guys that put a real scare into him one night that made him get out of the game altogether. There was nothing like that, she said. He's totally clean. Got a good job clearing out old houses. Like when someone dies, he gets all the junk out, gets it sorted, helps sort out the junk from the antiques, takes a commission of the sales. Does he skim? I asked. Maybe someone felt cheated? She shook her head. He buys the stuff he likes, but it's always a fair price. Everybody loved him, everybody. The cops investigated, of course, but there were no leads, no evidence of a break-in, no one with a grudge. It was like Maddie had twisted his own head off and set it in his lap. One of the detectives mentioned that more than half of murders go unsolved. It seemed this would be one of them. Weeks passed, and I stuck around, trying to help Elizabeth put her life back together. Even after the police were done scouring her place, she refused to go back in. We hired some people to clean up the blood, but they told me there was only so much they could do. The hardwood in the bedroom would never give up that stain. Finally, it fell on me to go into the place and gather a few of Elizabeth's things. They were going to put it up for sale. She was still in pieces, planning to move back in with her parents, probably permanently. I rented a truck and some basic tools, told her I'd get to work. Up until that point, I'd been staying in a cheap Airbnb nearby, but with Maddie's house reopened, I figured I could spend a few nights there while I packed up. When I mentioned the idea, Elizabeth gave me a weird look. "You shouldn't stay there," she said. "Why not?" I asked, but she couldn't come up with a good reason. Of course, the day I got into the place, the first thing I did was head to the bedroom. I guess I just had to see it. The cleaners had clearly scrubbed the hell out of the place, but there was still a nasty stain in the center of the room. The mark was roughly circular, and maybe 3 feet across, mostly gray, but grew darker at the edges, almost black. Before she sold the house, Elizabeth would have to have the boards replaced, maybe put in carpeting. Something. For a few seconds, I just stood there, looking at the black circle, imagining my brother inside it, permanently. Once I'd spent a few moments staring, I looked up from the stain, really taking the place in for the first time. Elizabeth hadn't been kidding about the antiques. All over the apartment were old hutches and paintings of ships at sea, sets of china, and cigar store Indians. My brother had always had an eye for quality. The thing that really stuck with me, though, was a wood carving of an owl, which was standing right in the corner of their old bedroom. The thing was larger than life, coming all the way up to my shoulder, carved all of a single trunk of elm. It was one solid piece, save for a single amber eye made of glass inlay. The other eye hole was empty, giving the odd impression that the carving was winking at you. The wood had been lacquered maybe a dozen times, leaving it with an uneven plastic sheen. Deep cracks ran through one of the wings and the neck, and the base was discolored from water damage. It certainly didn't look lifelike. Yet, somehow, it felt oddly alive. All afternoon, as I packed boxes of Elizabeth's clothes and shoes, the eye followed me. I'm usually not the kind of guy to get spooked by anything, but I guess after everything that had happened to Maddie, I got kind of on edge. Eventually, I threw an old towel over the carving's head, covering the eye. It felt a little stupid, but it made me feel a little better. A few hours went by, a bunch of boxes got packed, and it started to get dark. My first instinct was to sleep in the living room, away from the stain, and honestly away from the owl. I turned off the lights and stretched out on the couch, but it was old and lumpy, impossible to get comfortable. Maddie's mattress, practically brand new, lay untouched in the other room. Finally, after maybe an hour of rolling around, my back aching from the day of hard labor, I grabbed the blanket and headed for Maddie's old room, carefully walking around the black circle. As I tossed the blanket on the bed, I looked in the corner of the room at the owl carving. The towel I'd tossed over its head lay on the ground now. I wondered how it had fallen off. Maybe I'd been careless when I covered the statue in the first place. The eye caught the moonlight, watching. As stupid as it made me feel, I got up and walked over, picking the towel off the floor. As I did, I heard a distinct sound, something like rats' feet skittering inside the owl. I jumped back halfway to the bed, still holding the towel in my hand. For a moment I stared at the carving, daring it to move, waiting for another sound. Nothing. The whole time, though, even as I was watching it, the amber eye watched me. Slowly I walked back to the carving and threw the towel over it. Then, I backed across the room to the bed, not quite realizing I was stepping through the black circle on the floor. Finally, I collapsed onto the mattress, curled under the blanket, and fell asleep. I woke to a cracking sound. At first, everything was still. Then, through the moonlit near dark of the room, I watched as the owl statue began to move. First, its left wing pushed out from inside, then its right. The wood pushed out perhaps 5 inches, revealing something black and skeletal inside. It looked almost like the Transformers Maddie and I had played with as kids. Unseen robots pushing out through the plastic panels of a vehicle to reveal their hidden, shiny bones. I lay transfixed as 2 thin black legs pushed out hidden panels near the owl's base. The black legs, at least, they seemed like legs, couldn't have been much wider than a curtain rod. They pushed all the way down to the floor. Then, the whole carving began to move toward me. The wood swayed on some unseen thing inside it, some too thin creature wearing the wooden owl-like armor. I looked for a way out. I could have jumped through the window, but I was on the 2nd floor, and the thing was moving too fast now anyway. As it reached the bed, it reached out, its thin black arms growing impossibly long, its hands flattening and growing wide like dinner plates. Then it placed them over my ears, and everything went black. I woke to find myself sitting on a wooden chair from the kitchen. The owl must have brought it in while I was passed out. It had placed me inside the black circle. I thought of Maddie, sitting here just like me, not that long ago. I tried to move, but the long black rods that I'd assumed were the owl's legs bound my ankles to the chair. Its hands still gripped my head, their grip only slightly more relaxed than when it had first grasped me. The carving itself stood only a few inches in front of me. Though it fixed me with its amber eye, I could see now that the other eye hole was now open, revealing something black and moving inside. "What are you?" I asked, barely able to speak. I think it laughed. At least it sounded a little like a laugh. "I'm not quite an owl," it said. Its voice was low, echoing out through the cracks in the owl's wooden shell. "I'm not quite a person either. Some days I feel closer to bird, some days closer to man, but actually I've been around long before owls ever flew." "Of course," it continued. "Owls are generally far less interesting than humans. They're basic creatures. Give them a moonlit night and a field full of frightened mice and they'll be happy. So happy. Every single time. For humans, nothing is ever enough." It clicked its tongue, then got quiet. "But there is one area in which owls truly excel, which I have always admired," it said. "They are fantastic at turning their heads. So much better than humans. It's an area where it's not even a competition, not even close." As it said this, I felt the pressure from its plate-like hands increase against my temples, and it turned my neck about 90 degrees to the right. Not enough to hurt exactly, but it was certainly uncomfortable. I thought of Matty, his head twisted clean off and set carefully in his lap. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Because, as I said, humans are interesting, but also frustrating. Not to belabor the comparison to owls, but truly, your eyesight is quite poor. And not just your night vision. Your ability to see yourselves is quite abysmal. Watching you with only one eye, I can see truths about you that you simply cannot face." "What the fuck are you talking about?" I screamed. It held a black finger to its beaks, shushing me. "Please," it said. "If you must scream, wait until you really, really must. Later in the game, it may be unavoidable." "Game?" I whispered. "It's one of my own invention, though it's not too different than some human games. A little bit truth or dare, a little bit mercy, mostly mercy. The rules aren't complicated. I'll be telling you some truths about your life. Unpleasant truths. Each truth will come with a bit of pain, both mental and physical. When you've had enough, simply speak the word mercy, and your pain will be over." "And my head will be in my lap," I said. "Very good," it said. "I knew you were a smart one. In that case, it sounds like no further explanation will be needed. Except that I should add, the result of this exercise will be inevitable. You will eventually beg for mercy. Out of compassion, I'll go ahead and offer you an opportunity to ask for it right now, just to spare yourself the pain ahead." For a moment, I considered the offer. It would be easy to let it simply do what it wanted, to give my head one great final twist. That would be it. Nothing would hurt after that. But something in me wasn't ready to let go. "No," I said. "Not yet." Deep from within the owl's wooden head, the dark thing looked out at me. Then, it seemed to nod. I felt its impossibly strong hands tighten around my head and began to turn it, perhaps 10 more degrees to the right. It was definitely past the point of uncomfortable now. Along with this physical pain, I'll be stating a truth that carries a similar amount of mental anguish, said the dark, thin thing. I would like to start by saying that you were never a good brother. As a boy, you were the golden child, taking all of your mother's love, allowing a narrative to develop that your brother was the eternal fuck-up. Though you pretended to be kind to him, secretly, deep down you were happy to play the role of the favored son. Sometimes, it even made you happy to hear your mother ranting at him, refusing him meals as he cried in his room, knowing that his misdeeds only made you look all the better. "No," I said, trying to wriggle my neck free. "Is that what Maddie said?" I was a good brother. After Mom used to tear into him, I'd go to his room, bring him snacks when she threw his dinner in the trash. I took care of him. The thing's hands tightened around my head, turning it ever farther. "That happened once or twice," said the thing. "It was little comfort to your brother. More often than not, he went to sleep hungry, well aware that no one loved him, least of all you." I wanted to say more, but I knew it would only bring pain. I held my tongue. "Even in adulthood, you let your brother flounder," it said. "It would have been so easy to help him out with a few $1,000s. You knew he was destitute, selling drugs to make ends meet. He would have blown that money in a week," I said. "Might have gone on a bender, gotten himself killed." "No," it shouted, growing angry at me now. "You were selfish. You wanted to see him twist in the wind. You wanted to be superior." It twisted my neck 5 more degrees. I could feel the skin growing tight as it twisted, the muscles beneath straining against the black hands. "Why are you even here?" it asked. "You never visited when he was alive. Perhaps it actually frustrated you to see him getting his life together. Or is it Elizabeth? You always felt she was too good for Maddie. But you always secretly had a little crush, didn't you? Maybe now that's he's dead." "No," I said, and hot tears were starting to roll down my face. "I was just trying to be a good brother, I swear." "Too late," the thing shouted. "Too late." It twisted my head again. I felt a wetness on my skin and wondered if I had begun to bleed. "Mercy," the thing shouted. "Simply say the word and this will all be over. Your brother suffered far less." "I'm sorry, Maddie," I said, just talking into the dark. "I'm sorry. I did my best. I really did love you, always." "Mercy!" shouted the thing. "Just keep going," I said. "It'll be over soon enough, but I'll never ask for it. Never." As I said the words, the first rays of sun cut through the drawn shades. Where the rays struck the thing's hands, there was a smoky smell. "Mercy, quick, or it'll only hurt worse," shouted the thing, but there was a note of fear in its tone now. "Go ahead then," I said. But it didn't. The sun shone more brightly. Slowly, the pressure on my temples began to ease. The black limbs withdrew. The owl began to back away into its corner. By the time dawn had fully flooded the room, the carving was back in place. That morning, I returned to Elizabeth's parents' house with a few boxes of her things. I must have looked pretty wrecked, because she asked how I was doing, a note of concern in her voice. "I'm okay," I said. "But I can't stay here anymore. I've got to get home." She nodded, understanding. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "And I think I can handle the rest. I've been leaning on you too hard." Suddenly, a wave of panic flooded through me. "Promise you won't stay there," I said. "Promise." "I would never," she said. Even when Maddie was alive, I didn't like sleeping there. All those old antiques. I never liked the smell. But Maddie loved them, so... "Thank you," I said, trying to stay composed. "For being so good to him." She reached out and gave me a big hug. "I know you two hadn't hung out much over the last few years, but Maddie always said you were there when he needed him," she said. "Now I see what he meant." She looked over at my rental truck. There, in the bed, lay the wooden owl. "Is that one of Maddie's?" she asked. "I was hoping you'd let me have it," I said. "One last thing to remember him by?" She shrugged. "I've never seen it before. Maybe he'd just gotten it." "Yeah," I said. "Could be." I said goodbye and got in the truck, and then I drove. I headed out in the city, out where the urban sprawl gave way to some kind of forest, marked with a few sunny meadows. When I was satisfied that I'd reached the middle of nowhere, I stopped. I took the statue from the bed of the truck and dragged it out into a sunny field. All the while, I heard the skittering sound inside. It was getting hot, toward afternoon, and I could tell the heat and light was affecting the thing inside. I knew the wood was full of little cracks. Some of them must have been big enough to let the light through. "It's still only noon," I said. "Not quite the hottest part of the day. That'll be hours from now, maybe at 3 or 4. I wonder if you'll make it that far." A small shriek emerged from inside the owl. I ignored it. "Now over in the truck I've got a saw," I continued. "I could cut this owl shell of yours right in half and let the light take you, and I will. But first, I'm going to need you to ask for mercy." When Ben died, he made very little noise. It was the computers that alerted me. Shrill alarms and flashing lights. I hadn't even gotten out of my sleeping bag before my smartwatch had lit up with half a dozen messages about system failures. Astronaut 1, heart rate monitor failure. Astronaut 1, skin conductance monitor failure. Astronaut 1, VO2 monitor failure. The situation didn't sink in until I was shaking an unresponsive Ben. White eyes rolling back into his skull. Blood pooling in his ears like red jelly. Viscosity, mass, no gravity. It made me nauseous to look at. HQ would later say Ben died from an aneurysm. 1 in a million. A freak death that just happened to occur in low Earth orbit. So what now? I asked after all the panic had died down and the reality of my situation finally settled in. HQ sent me a rarely used or discussed document that outlined what I'd have to do. Bodies pose a unique threat in microgravity, it explained. All that order becomes disordered. What is solid turns to liquid. What is liquid turns to gas. First thing I needed to do was to put Ben's body somewhere that had no oxygen and was freezing cold. Somewhere he would pose no danger to himself or me. Isolated, but easily retrievable. The conclusion was obvious. I knew what they'd suggest before I even reached that part of the booklet. It happened so fast that Ben was still warm when I put him in the special bag, designed to endure the vacuum of space. I kept expecting him to protest as I pulled at stiffening limbs and manipulated swelling joints. Every step of the process, every zip, every bit of Velcro. I had to remind myself he wasn't going to complain. It felt intimate, but it wasn't. Intimacy requires two people. By that point, Ben was just meat. The spacewalk itself was something else. The bag that surrounded Ben's body inflated in the vacuum, and I instinctively felt the urge to undo what I'd done. There was a body in there, and bodies aren't meant to have so little between them and outer space. When I touched the bag, I could still feel him beneath the paper-thin material. The crease of an elbow, the bump of his nose. By the time I reached my destination, his body already felt brittle. Attaching him to the station was easy enough, on a technical level. Leaving him there went against every instinct I had. After that, there was no pretending he was coming back. A day later, and I began to pack his things away. There was a catharsis in it that I found calming. I cataloged his belongings with thin detachment. Most of his things were dry and uninteresting. Photos of him with a dog, a copy of a Michael Shea book, a certificate of excellence from NASA that he received when he was 10. He discovered a comet, he'd told me during our first meeting. Backyard with a telescope. NASA let him name it and everything. That was how he knew he wanted to be an astronaut. Described it as a calling. Ben was like that. A real-life Boy Scout. In life, he'd had no edges. You'd think, given our history, we'd be close. Two men selected based on extensive psychological profiling. Together, we had simulated multiple missions to Mars. 2 on the ground, 1 in space, all of them highly secretive. An official mission to Mars was meant to be next, at which point the whole project would be made public. But the key to having 2 people work together, alone, for nearly an entire year, isn't to find 2 guys who are best friends forever. It's finding people who won't grate on one another. Neither hate nor love. 2 men who enjoy their own company but don't mind one another. Ben and I had become acquainted over all that time together, but it wasn't like we were brothers in arms. We worked so well precisely because there was no meat to the friendship. No stakes. Nothing to argue over. To me, Ben was a nice guy, but that was all. I figured he was plain and simple all the way down. No dark secrets. No real problems to speak of. The journal changed that. It was taped to the inside of a panel of a computer at his workstation. He must have hidden it close to his things, somewhere out of sight but easily retrievable. Frayed leaves and yellowed pages, like some ancient artifact. Last thing I expected to find in a space station. I almost mistook its leather cover for some sort of personal Bible, the sort of well-worn tome held up by a preacher making exclamations about the devil. But its insides were handwritten and hardly in keeping with a Bible. Scribbles, shapes, phrases repeated and dissected. Some of it was even in binary. It seemed like the ravings of a child or a lunatic. I thought it was maybe a mindfulness exercise, empty-headed doodling to help him get his head straight during stressful moments. But that didn't explain why he'd hidden it, and why the numbers and pages seemed strangely organized. I don't know how to describe it exactly, except to say there was the vague impression that it meant something to the person who'd made it. Every last gram on a shuttle is accounted for. What you bring up with you, it can't be some random crap you want last minute. Ben would have had to clear the journal. I'm assuming he kept the contents secret. One look at what he'd been writing, and NASA would have had him in psych eval before the end of the day. But the book's size and weight would have had to be logged and accounted for. It could not have gotten on the station by accident, so I knew immediately that Ben had wanted it for something. I studied it for over an hour trying to figure out what that was. Flicking from one page to the next, glaring at rows of numbers, strange fractals, something that looked like a cross between an eye and a textbook drawing of an atom. Given the way his writing and art skills developed throughout the book, I began to suspect he'd been adding to it since his childhood, which was just another layer to the growing mystery. I thought I was never going to get any insight into the book until, about 3/4 of the way through, I came across yet another page filled with rows and rows of numbers. Only this time, one of the strings was underlined, and a single word had been scratched ragged and angry next to it. The only bit of English, or any human language, in all those pages. The only thing written in a way that could make sense to a living human. The word itself made me stop dead in my tracks, made my blood run cold. 1703, 1804, 2636 aneurysm. The suspicion that came over me felt like a kind of madness. I told myself I had to be nuts when I checked the data from Ben's biomonitor, that I had to be crazy to even entertain the notion. But the information recorded by several different machines confirmed it. Ben's exact time of death was the 17th of March 2018, 0426 hours and 36 seconds. I don't think I moved for a good 15 minutes after that. Just stared at the data as my mind worked its way around a giant, impossible realization. Ben knew he was going to die. Of course I tried to rationalize this. Anyone would. I came up with half a dozen reasons he'd written what he'd written. None of them were comforting, although they at least fit in with a more rational worldview. Take, for example, the idea that Ben had killed himself at that exact moment in time to meet some sort of prophecy he'd scrawled days or even hours before. Was that a good thing? What did it mean for me? Ignore the logistical issues. What poison can be timed to the second? Let's just say that's what he did. That left the hair-raising question of why, and there was no comfortable answer that I could see. Of course, I went through that book with a fine-tooth comb looking for any more clues. I wish I hadn't. I eventually found another word, this one closer to the very end of the journal. Another date and timestamp, one that lay 6 weeks in the future, and another word scratched painfully into the paper by a clumsy fist. Immolation. Permission denied. I bit my lip and took a deep breath. What about the station's integrity? I asked. No sign of any issue from external cameras, they replied. I can hear something banging on the hull, I told them. Nothing is visible on the cameras. That's why I need to go take a look, I wrote. It's hard to argue with a computer. You can't shoot at a death glare. HQ could have easily arranged video calls, but really they wanted the distance. Made it easier to say no. Solo spacewalk is incredibly dangerous, they quickly wrote back. Microphones in station hull are reporting nothing of concern. Usual impact from debris. Nothing that corroborates reports of external tapping. Permission for spacewalk is denied. I made no further response, but instead closed the screen and wondered if they were being entirely truthful. The tapping sound, coming and going over the last few days, was unmistakable, even over all those whirring machines and motors. Space stations are loud. They even give us earplugs to handle it. But whatever was out there was somehow louder. Or perhaps, given the circumstances, I was just sensitive to the thought of something, anything out there. There was no denying it annoyed me. Just one of those sounds I found impossible to block out. Like water dripping in a bathtub at 3 a.m. Tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap. No sense of order, not on the surface level, but something maybe. Underneath. Some sense or reason. Some kind of regularity that the brain detects and can't let go of. How could the microphones possibly miss it? Sleep was getting progressively difficult. At times I thought the station under some kind of hidden stress. Materials freezing and warming in irregular ways. No atmosphere, no conduction of heat. Things get hot in the sun's rays. Objects warm and cool to both extremes. This is routine stuff for anything up in space, of course. But it didn't stop me thinking about all the ways the station was just a pile of metal that could come undone. Could break and tear. Bend and stretch. Like watching the wing of your plane wobble during turbulence, it's an uncomfortable reminder that you're just a monkey in a fancy toy. And what if something had come loose? Something. Oh, haha. At first, I stuck to this notion strictly, asking myself, what if some antenna or strap or bit of metal had gotten loose and was banging against the hull? That would be bad. But of course, that wasn't really what I was thinking. It's what I wrote to HQ about, over and over and over. But what was really on my mind was the thought that maybe, somehow, he had gotten loose. And of course, that's not so silly, right? The specially designed bag he was in, the one that would vent any gases produced by decomposition while maintaining his body's integrity, was brand spanking new. Know how many times it had been tested? Never. Never ever. Ben was the first. So of course it might come loose. Just because it's space-age technology doesn't mean it's sophisticated. He was strapped to the outside like a Christmas tree to the family sedan. Maybe, I wondered, one of the straps had broken, and now he was thumping against the side every now and again. Never mind that there wasn't anything out there to prompt that kind of buffeting. No air, no wind. If he'd come loose, he'd just float a little farther away. But something was making that noise, and I worried almost constantly that it was him. Only problem was I had cameras, lots, and all of them, every single time, showed the same thing. The bag, barely changed from when I last saw it in person, strapped firmly and securely to the station's hull. This should have reassured me. Should have, but it didn't. Something was out there, tapping at the hull. On and off. No pattern, no reason, no correlation. It came and it went, seemingly choosing its moments to bother me the most. Sleep was difficult for multiple reasons. The tapping was bad enough, but lately my nightmares had taken a strange turn. Black. Cold. In them I was trapped in a suffocating film, freezing cold. Non-stop agony, fighting furiously to free myself was this black void of a nightmare. Like all deeply terrible dreams, it colored my thoughts for the rest of the day. And each time I had it, it got harder to shake. I tried to endure. Compartmentalize. Take my mental turmoil and put it in a box, right unhinged across the lid, and sit rocking back and forth waiting for my rescue. And that was an option. A good one. But there was one little word that stopped me going the route of hunkering down and ignoring my own madness. Immolation. When HQ told me the date of the shuttle would reach me, I spent quite a bit of time wondering if this wasn't just some big experiment. The sheer coincidence of it all. The magnitude of it. They'd sent me the message, and the subject line had 3 exclamation points. Like the communications officer on the other side couldn't wait to deliver good news for once. Let their professionalism slip. They'd finally arranged a shuttle to retrieve me after it was done dropping some guys off at the ISS. It was lucky it had come so soon. A stroke of logistical genius allowed them to sneak Ben and me back without it being too conspicuous. I should be very thankful, they told me, but I was just stunned. The date matched the one Ben had written out. Factoring in travel time, I'd be entering Earth's atmosphere at the exact time the prophesied moment would come and go. Ripe for an error, a misplaced heat pad, a mistimed thruster, something. Anything to go wrong and leave me plunging to my death in a burning metal tube. Ripe for immolation. If it wasn't Ben out there tapping away, I wanted to know. I needed to know. I was a rational man, a skeptic. I did not believe the natural world would produce a man that could predict his death down to the minute or the second, nor did I believe he could predict mine. But I am only an animal. I am made of meat, vulnerable, a raw nerve in a world of jagged rocks, and I am risk-averse. That word, immolation, not random, not chance. Up in the void surrounded by pure oxygen, fire was a constant risk. Ben's little numbers loomed large in my mind. I had to make sure everything was in place. Had to make sure there were no errors. If it was a prediction, which I refused to accept at face value, then maybe I could take heart from it. What could Ben do in the face of an aneurysm? Nothing. But immolation, fire, an accident. That sort of thing could be avoided. Just so long as everything was in working order. Just so long as everything was where it was meant to be. What did HQ know? Cameras and remote operators. Not enough. No one else was in that tin can except me. Why even have humans in space if you wouldn't trust their instincts and judgments? I needed to know what was making that noise. I needed to get out there. HQ caught on too late. I was inside the suit, the airlock cycling by the time they realized. I chose my timing well, halfway through my maintenance shift. Told them I was taking a look at the suit, make sure everything was in order. Meant they were slow to catch on to what I was doing. Technically, they could stop the process at any stage. They could do anything from their side. But I threatened to force a manual override that would shut them out from that part of the system. They told me they'd court-martial on return, but that was a piss-weak threat. For me, the stakes were higher than a court-martial. In the end, they backed down. Know how hard it is to build a space station in secret? It came first. If the spacewalk went wrong and I died, the station would still be there. $1 billion asset awaiting the next top-secret mission. It was my neck on the line, not theirs. I accepted it. Under time pressure, HQ accepted it too. By the time the door finally opened and I was able to gently guide myself out and around the rim so that I was clinging onto the station's exterior, they'd already tapped into the cameras and were guiding me along to my destination. But it was background noise to me at that point. Their voices and little pings, constant readouts of suit temperatures, and the distance to the station hull. Meaningless. All of it. What mattered was the sound. Tap, tap, tap. I was anxious by this point. Or perhaps, if I'm honest, scared. Space is all extremes. Not just heat, but light too. The shadows cast are vast and strange. You move in and out of the Earth's shadow like it's a hand in front of a projector. And the ones cast by yourself and your surroundings are a special kind of black. The station, with its myriad of pipes and cables, was covered in abyssal shadows. Long, warped things with ambiguous origins. Sometimes I looked at the darkness and wondered if there was anything there at all, or if the station was simply bisected by some kind of strange cosmic force, like I might fall into it somehow. Forever lost. Normally I'd think it was beautiful. Spacewalks had for me, in the past, been an almost religious experience. This carried the same sense of weight, but for very different reasons. I felt watched, something I tried to ignore, but it got harder and harder. Kept looking over my shoulder. Kept overthinking every little bump and vibration I felt on the station's hull. By the time I reached the place where I had strapped Ben's body, I was close to a panic attack. That whole part of the station was covered in darkness. The kind where I couldn't see a damn thing. It was only HQ's voice telling me I'd reached my destination that let me know Ben was lying just a few feet from me. Under their direction, I found him. And when my light fell upon the bag itself, I saw the metallic fabric glitter with ice. Touching it, I felt Ben's frozen body inside, hard as rock. I gave him a nudge, and he didn't move an inch. The straps holding him in place were still there, firm as ever. What else could be causing the sound? I asked. There is one option. The nameless voice on the other end sounded reticent, but that had been the default since Ben died. HQ always sounded like they were holding something back. What's that? We are not 100% certain how corpses would respond to the changing temperatures and vacuum. Obviously, parts of the body will freeze and expand. Fluids in particular. Right now, the bag has a lot of surface contact with the metallic hull. One theory is that blood may be freezing and sublimating as the surface beneath changes temperature. I looked at the bag and grimaced. How much blood exactly? We cannot possibly say for certain how much would have left the body, only that the bag's job is to contain it until return. We are able to confirm using instruments in the station that the panel you are standing on is well below freezing. Everything should be in a manageable state, so to speak. Solid, likely one large clump. They replied, and then after a moment they added, "You wanted this. It would be a waste of resources now that you're out here not to investigate further. You need to look inside." Of course I'd wanted this, hadn't I? To satisfy my morbid curiosity? To address the rabid thoughts in my mind that had kept me awake, filling what little sleep I had with nightmares. Now that I was at the threshold, I found myself so afraid that even moving my hand took a kind of effort. And yet I had no choice. I had to see this through. The bag opened with a specially designed zipper. No sound, but I could feel the click, click, click of the specialized teeth opening up. It's stupid, but as I unfurled the flap, I could have sworn a terrible fetid stench passed over me. It lasted no more than a few seconds, but was so vivid I turned and snapped my eyes shut as they watered. Power of suggestion, I told myself as I reopened them. That was all. Nothing more. No air, no sound, no smell. I took a few deep breaths, tried not to let the incident unsettle me further, and looked inside the bag. Multiple people watching my video feed gasped while I made a fairly unflattering noise somewhere between a moan and a cry. I'd expected something. God, at worst, I'd expected something ghoulish. Blue skin. Icicles collecting around the eyelashes, like a body found in the Arctic. But Ben had transformed. Great, jagged shards of frozen blood had erupted from the eyes and ears and mouth. His jaw dislocated to an unnatural angle as an icicle the size of my forearm forced its way out. His neck was broken, his torso shredded with strips of flesh hanging off in ribbons, and his hands were clawing at his face with bizarre yellow nails. They'd even left grooves in his skin. What the fuck is this? I asked no one in particular, only to realize that HQ had been talking amongst themselves the whole time. A malfunction in the bag. Unexpected pressure. Temperature changes. No, this isn't normal. Let's not pretend this is normal. Guys! I shouted, splitting the chatter and leaving silence. Why are his arms like that? Muscle spasms, possibly caused by, well, whatever caused the unusual reaction in his circulatory system. Maybe that caused his arms to curl up towards his face. There are scratch marks on his cheeks, I replied. Skin under his nails. Are we sure he was dead when I brought him out here? A dozen urgent, alarmed voices, all desperate to avoid even the slightest hint of responsibility, told me no. That was not possible. But looking down at Ben's tortured face, I couldn't help but feel a bit of doubt. I was about to ask what I ought to do next when the sun rose across the station. Unlike Earth, this wasn't a gentle morning. It flipped like a light switch. Thankfully, the suit reacted before it had a chance to blind me, but the temperature began to rapidly climb. I watched as something beneath Ben's skin began to writhe in the new warmth. That's definitely not normal. We can offer no further insight into the situation as of this moment. The footage you're sending us is under review by a panel of experts, HQ told me, somewhat urgently and robotically, like the person on the other end was stifling panic. Current orders are to take samples, reseal the bag, and return to the station. You sure I should be taking this stuff inside? There was some mumbling before the same operator replied. Forget samples. Seal the bag. Return to the station. Gladly, I replied, before pulling the zipper shut. I was keen to leave and made the journey back faster than I should have. That crawling sensation you feel when being watched, it was all over me, made me clumsy, and I knocked myself more than once on the way back, like I was suddenly unused to the suit's controls. I just couldn't escape the notion that everywhere I looked, someone or something had darted back just out of view. Of course, that was impossible, so I told myself. What could survive out in space? But it only made it that much worse to imagine something slinking into the shadows, tapping on the hull, stalking me every step of the way back. When I finally reached the door, the tension inside me rose. If something was going to happen, it would happen now with my back turned on infinity. I had never felt so vulnerable. Reynolds? The sound made me jump. I'd been so focused on my surroundings I'd forgotten I was being supervised by a room full of people 1,000 miles away. What is it? Reynolds, we're seeing something here we're not sure of. Being told you should hold off on returning. Something about the voice on the other end made my stomach sink. They didn't just sound confused, and make no mistake, when you're clinging to the side of a station all on your own, confused would have been bad enough. But no, there was something else. Fear. There's an anomaly, they added. No one down here knows how to proceed. We're currently seeking input from higher OPS. This is unprecedented. What's going on? It began with, signals from some of the biomonitors, specifically Ben's. That last word hit like a truck. What? Yes. And the cameras are... At first we thought they were malfunctioning. It appeared as if Ben's bag was empty. And then, Reynolds, we noticed something. Something else. Guys, what's going on here? I'm being told I can't say more. Just wait. I tightened my grip on the railing, my heart pounding. Finally, the door cycled open and I was ready to disregard all orders when the man speaking to me from HQ practically screamed in my ear. Don't enter! Reynolds, do not enter the station. What we're seeing on the cameras, you can't let that in. If something's out here, I'm getting to safety before it reaches me. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped. My brain processed. I'd heard that. I'd heard something in the vacuum of space. I looked around at my hands, my feet. That couldn't be possible. Not unless... Tap, 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 tap. Without moving my head, I turned my eyes towards the very edge of my helmet's vision and watched as a single yellow fingernail tapped gently on the glass. The man in HQ spoke in a terrifying whisper. He's on your suit. The terror that shot through me was electric, white fire coursing through my veins. Without even thinking, I reacted like I'd just found out there was a grenade strapped to my back. All instinct, no rationality. I cried out and swung around, trying to knock Ben off my back, but all I accomplished was setting off some alarms as I damaged my suit. Get it off! I screamed at no one in particular. Get it off me! I thrashed desperately and felt something shuffling around the exterior of the bulky suit. Finally, my eyes fell on something useful. The jet controls. I fumbled my hands into place and immediately blasted myself into the open pressure chamber, turning at the last minute so that the back of the suit smashed into the thick secondary door. I only hoped that whatever was clinging to the back of me was destroyed by the impact. But when I looked up, Ben was still out there gawping at me with a mouthful of frozen blood. Slowly, his movement packed with the eerie confidence of a predator, he prepared to enter the station. Reynolds, get away from the door. We're initiating an emergency shutdown. Ben had one hand inside when the door slammed shut and cut it off. Even in space with the bulkhead between us, I could have sworn I heard him scream. There was no ignoring Ben or the sounds he made. Not anymore. Terrible thumps that battered the station, their location changing seemingly at random. This drove the people on the ground insane. Oh, I'd heard my fair share of rationalization over the last few hours. Been sent books worth of written material from every type of expert you could imagine. Ever since my colleague's death, I'd been wrestling with all sorts of bizarre thoughts, but after the spacewalk, it was like they'd spilled out of my head and were now terrorizing other like-minded skeptics. Try as they might, no one in HQ could make sense of it. But they didn't have the journal. After what happened during my spacewalk, it became a priority for me to figure out what the fuck was going on. Those numbers Ben had recorded weren't gibberish. I'd sort of known that from the start. To read them was to feel like you were reading another language, something secret and hidden. And while I never cracked the code, not even now after all this time, I did figure out where Ben had found it. Light. The trick was to dig deeper into Ben's research. Specifically, a pet project of his he'd spent nearly his entire life chasing. A little comet, a ball of ice, way out in the Kepler belt close to where the solar system abates and the great cosmic void begins. Something small and insignificant that rotated and shifted and occasionally caught the sun, bouncing photons right back at us. A glittering snowball so faint as to be invisible unless you happen to look at the right place at the right time, like Ben did when he was just 10 and playing with hobbyist Dad's backyard telescope. A light in the darkness. A light that spoke to a few instruments Ben had adjusted to record each little emission. Flash on, flash off, flash on, flash off, flash on, tap, tap, tap. Binary to hexadecimal, and from there, God, something else. Something that spoke to him. Something out there had spoken to him. I don't know what scared me more. The sound of a reanimated Ben pounding away at the station. An imminent, all-too-near threat. Or the thought of something in the void whispering unknown secrets to a man for the last 2 decades. An idea that occasionally rose over me like the tide, swallowing me whole if I dwelt on it for more than a few moments. I never did figure out what the transmission was saying, but I was transfixed nonetheless. Not just by Ben's little journal that contained hundreds, thousands of handwritten records, but the live transmission he had set up on his computer, the one he'd converted into a sound. It was like an earworm on steroids, like white noise made of acid, a flood of alien ideas that left me confused and drooling if I listened for too long. All told, I spent no more than a few days with access to that transmission, and by the end, I felt like I was on the verge of melting away. But Ben had been exposed to that thing since his childhood, spent years and years listening and recording and waiting, working towards something none of us could really hope to understand. I had to assume that transmission was responsible for his death, and even worse, what had happened to him afterwards. Had it always been the reason for his coming to space? Had the Ben I'd known just been a sham? The sound, the light coming from out there. It felt wrong. It wasn't a gentle lull or a siren's pull. It was dark and overpowering. Why had he given into it? Why had he done everything it wanted? How much of his life had been lived because of its needs and wants? One thing I could be sure of as I spent days listening to Ben's furious rampage on the exterior of the station, whatever had spoken to him. It was hostile, and it couldn't be allowed to come back with me. Reynolds, I'm being told this is going to be a bit of unconventional pickup. I scoffed as I finished suiting up. That was an understatement. What did they tell you? I asked as I pulled the helmet down and initiated the door's opening sequence. There are concerns about contamination, the pilot told me. Not sure what that means. Didn't say if it was biological or chemical. All sounds a little weird if you ask me. But we're meant to pick you up mid-space walk. Is that right? Yep, I replied. Huh, you up for that? We're told we can come about 200 meters away, but you'll have to close the rest with the suit's thrusters. Gonna be something else for you. Untethered journey from one vehicle to the next. It's never been done before. I'm well aware of the risks, I said. Just keep your eyes peeled. This time it was his turn to scoff. For what? He cried. You'll know it when you see it. I made the journey with my back to the shuttle, floating in the wrong direction at a slow but consistent speed. My eyes glued to the station, looking for some signs of Ben. There was the occasional flash of something red, a slight shimmer of movement often obscured by some of the station's panels and antennae, that let me know he was still on the exterior, skulking around somewhere. So long as he stayed there, I knew I'd be okay. But the entire time I kept waiting for the other foot to drop, for the tension to finally explode into that life-threatening danger I knew was waiting for me. It came as a surprise when I finally approached the shuttle without incident. Pilot told me I was a few meters away, and it was time to turn around. So I did, drifting around as gently as a diver returning to the surface. I had my back to the station no more than a few seconds when the pilot grunted. Huh, that's odd. He sounded nonchalant, but the object that hit me was anything but minor. Ben, uninterested in making the journey safely, had launched himself off the station as fast as he could, and with no way of slowing down, he hit me at full speed, slamming me up against part of the doorframe, and sending us both tumbling out into the void, before anyone had even had the time to register his attack. This time, he was not letting me get a door between us. He scrambled over my suit like a deranged insect, one that I desperately tried to swat away as the great void spun around us both. Stars turned to lines, the shuttle swooping past my helmet's field of view in almost random directions. It was sickening and terrifying, and I hoped to God I'd be able to correct the spin before it got out of control, but all of that came second to the monster who was clinging to my suit. At some point, he crawled around in such a way that I got a good look at him, the first in a few days. It was up close, personal. Even with the helmet's glass between us, I could make out such stark and startling detail that I momentarily froze in terror, aware only vaguely of the pilot's panicked transmissions. Jesus Christ, what the fuck is that thing? Reynolds, you need to get yourself stabilized. Much further and we won't be able to help. And whatever you do, you need to know that fucking thing isn't coming aboard this shuttle. I wanted to reply, but I was busy trying to get an arm between me and Ben, who was now a profusion of jagged red crystals of varying sizes. Some as big as kitchen knives, others like sewing needles. A spacesuit's worst nightmare. A puncture wouldn't lead to the immediate decompression you're probably thinking of. Instead, I'd have a few moments at most before the air enveloping the suit dissipated. And after that, my lungs would collapse, my blood would start to boil, and the water inside my eyes, nose, ears, and other soft tissues would vaporize and try to escape. Like frostbite on fast forward. But punctures weren't my sole concern. I knew I had to stop Ben's hands getting a grip on the helmet. I don't know if whatever had animated him had access to all his memories, but Ben sure as shit knew how to remove a helmet from the exterior, so all my focus went on keeping his nasty little fingers away from my neck. A puncture would still leave me enough time to return to the shuttle, but with no helmet, I'd be doomed to a very painful death. So I fought the best I could, knowing everything hinged on me pushing him away. But Ben was lithe and insectile, constantly slipping out of reach whenever I got close to giving him a good shove. His fingers could easily find purchase on the suit and its many little greebles, while I was basically wielding oven gloves that offered no dexterity. I had no hope of shaking him off the usual way, but I did have something on my side: inertia. The whole time we'd been spinning furiously, and that rotational force was just about the only thing trying to peel the two of us apart. So far, I'd been fighting it. But why? I realized at the last moment I had one option left, so I jammed half thrusters on and decided to make the nearly out-of-control spin much, much worse. Normally, an uncontrolled spin is one of those nightmare scenarios any astronaut dreads. Humans are irregularly shaped, and once you start rotating along more than one axis, applying more force is likely just to make it worse. Correcting takes a huge amount of experience and insight, and even then, there's no guarantee you can stop it. More likely is that by the time you figure out what you need to do, the rotational forces will have you on the brink of unconsciousness. And from there, death is just a stone's throw away. For me, it was the only chance I had. So I accelerated the spin and kept accelerating, holding the button down until the forces at play pulled Ben further and further towards the front of the suit. That's where inertia wanted us. Two objects in near symmetry, ready to break off in opposite directions at any moment. Ben held on for longer than I did. At some point, my limbs went weak, my vision dark, and my arms fell to my side, no longer able to fight the monster off. But by then, it took everything Ben had just to cling onto me, and he could no longer attack or fumble at my helmet. Eventually, even he had to give in as the spin grew faster and faster, and the forces trying to separate us grew too strong. It was like every roller coaster I'd been on merged into one and ramped up to 11. The last thing I remembered before I lost consciousness was the sight of Ben's monstrous face being flung off into the void. I came to aboard the shuttle. Several men and women crowded around me. Jesus Christ, you're a lucky son of a bitch. I groaned and made eyes towards the person who had spoken. It sounded like the pilot. Nice to put a face to the voice. I don't feel lucky, I gasped. You spun right towards us. We were already suited up and on our way, timed up well. That suit was riddled with holes. Any later and we wouldn't have been around to catch you and get you into safety. As it is, pal, you're going home. Medical check shows no real issues. I think you're going to be okay. Where's Ben? The people around me shared a funny look before one of them realized. Benjamin Whately? The other astronaut on board? Is that who was attacking you? I nodded. Well, he's gone, they replied. If that really was your colleague, we're sorry. I feel like there's a story we're missing. I'll catch you up when I'm feeling better, I coughed. Well, whatever happened to him, he'll be re-entering Earth's atmosphere in the next hours, the pilot replied. What then? I asked. The pilot thought for a second. Human body on re-entry? He'll go up in flames. Immolation. That's a wrap for today on the Midnight Mystery. Hope you guys had as much fun as we did. If you liked what you saw, hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Oh, and don't be shy. Drop a comment below with your thoughts or any cool mystery ideas you want us to check out. Until next time, we'll see you in the next Midnight Mystery.